Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Our podcast takes on a bit of a different flavor today with our two guests, Jeri Prochaska and Tom Netting of CSPEN, the Central States Private Education Network, which represents schools nationwide to public policymakers in Washington and throughout the nation. Jeri is the founder and co-executive director of CSPEN, which is a product of her passion for the education industry. Jeri brings more than 2 decades of work in education in the areas of admissions, accreditation, and compliance, both inside and working for schools. Tom Netting has worked in the public policy arena for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. Tom's established himself as a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy in the areas of higher education and workforce development, healthcare, veterans affairs policies, and the procurement of federal appropriations. Jeri, Tom, great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Let's get started. Jeri, tell me a little bit about Central States Private Education Network, CSPEN. How did you guys come about with this idea, and what is it that y'all do?
Well, it actually really did come about from an idea. I had actually spent most of my careers working in schools, and then I went over to the vendor B2B side, and had noticed back in about 2008 that things were a little sketchy for a lot of my clients. And it seemed to me, I lived in Minnesota, and it seemed to me that a lot of, both in my state and in surrounding states, those that did not have a state association or someone that was, really working on behalf of all those schools right there in that state were really under attack. They didn't really have anything to hold up to help them in the community, to make a better judgment from the policymakers and that type of thing. And I had thrown the idea around to a couple people, and someone said, you need to talk to Tom Netting. And I had heard of him, didn't know him personally, but picked up the phone and we started talking. And right away, it just was a great fit for us. And we were both really excited. Myself being in the business-to-business side, we knew at that time the schools were very tapped on what they were be able to contribute to start something new like this. But the vendors were very excited about it. They came on and started donating to us to make it happen. We then did all of that fun paperwork to be a 501c3, which is where we are now. And we're actually, CSPEN is really driven on those people that believe and want an organization that speaks to them. And that's really who we are.
Well, I think it speaks to them, but I think you also speak for them when you get into D.C. And Tom, that's where you come in, isn't it?
It is, but we have to be a little bit careful about that. As a 501c3, we don't spend the vast majority of our time on advocacy directly. As Jeri said, what we are primarily focused on, and the impetus from the beginning, was making sure the community had all of the information that was coming out of Washington, be that the committees, meaning the House Education and the Workforce Committee, or the Senate Health Committee, or from the Department of Education or elsewhere. So communication, we thought, was the key, and just wanting to share as much information with as many in the community as possible is how we hope to help them help themselves to advocate.
Oh, that's a great mission.
I'll just add on a tiny bit more that along with us giving them the information, I think what really sets us apart is that we're listening constantly. We're in the different states. We're answering the phones. We're taking emails, getting the questions. And it's really not our agenda. It's their agenda.
That's great. That's the key to a successful organization, is listening to who your customer is.
We couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And so I would guess that in the last 1.5 to 2 years, you guys have been a little busy.
That would kind of be an understatement. Obviously, the changes on the legislative front and regulatory front, we thought we were going to have a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act this year. Congress saw fit to attempt to move legislation, or at least consider moving legislation, but didn't in fact get very far. The House completed markup and never brought a bill to the floor. The Senate had a number of hearings, as did the House, but never even actually introduced legislation. So a great deal of time this year has been spent on the legislative side, tracking what now looks like to be a 2019-2020 proposition in the 116th Congress on the legislative side. Regulatorily, we certainly have been very, very busy. A number of changes brought about by the Obama administration are being contemplated for revision or repeal under the Trump administration. And so for the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been actively engaged in processes called negotiated rulemaking to make changes to the borrower defense to repayment regulations, the gainful employment regulations, and still others that the new administration, or now the not so new administration, almost halfway through their four-year tenure, are going to be looking at going into 2019. Those include key issues on definition of a credit hour, a lot on distance education and online learning. But yeah, to say that we've been busy and that the community has been busy would definitely be accurate, if not an understatement.
Let's drill down on some of those, starting off with the regulatory revisions and the court decisions.
Sure. As I think you know, and we talked about earlier, Drum, there's been a considerable amount of discussion in the wake of some of the large closings of the publicly traded institutions, the Corinthians, the ITTs, and the others, that students should be protected if they truly was fraud against the by the institution against the students. And there is statutory guidance and regulatory guidance that provides regulatory relief in the form of the ability for a borrower to put forth a claim and have their loans pulled back. Anybody, I think, and everybody in the community agrees that when those type of circumstances arise, the students should get all of their opportunities for relief that are afforded to them. There have been changes, however, in the Obama administration to basically take that fundamental premise and put it on steroids and provide opportunities for relief for individuals that candidly may not necessarily need or deserve it, but based on the concerns of the manner in which many believe and some attest and assert in the courts have stated that there are problems with the regulatory process and with what Corinthian and ITT did. They've sought the opportunity to ensure that all students that went through those institutions got relief. There's been other litigation that speaks to the contrary, and we've been watching that play out in the court system. Most recently, we've had two different decisions. One stating that students that didn't file an application are not eligible for relief, but only those that followed through on the opportunities afforded them by the department can seek relief, and over 100,000 have done so, and we hope them and wish for them the best. But the courts have also stated that regulatory stays and a repeal of and a delay in the implementation of those regulations the Trump administration has put into place is no longer valid. It was deemed to be arbitrary and capricious. So we're now looking at those regulations that were scheduled to take effect in 2016 going into effect effectively last 2 weeks ago on October 12th. The problem is that we now need guidance and transitional guidance for the department to the new department and the new administration to show how that gets implemented. And all the while, you have them also stating and looking to develop new regulations that basically would lay asunder and set aside that interim set of guidance and regulation we're talking about. If you're confused as mud, so is everybody else. We're all awaiting some guidance that hopefully will make this much clearer. And that's one of the things that CSPEN has attempted to try and do is very slowly and prudently accurately report when new information and guidance that speaks to compliance and how institutions are to comply comes out.
Yeah, I am totally confused by everything that I read. You guys help clarify it, but I don't know there's any way of clarifying some of the decisions that are coming out there. Now, I recently read that the over 100,000 people who have applied for regulatory relief or borrower defense relief, less than 100 have received it. Is that correct?
I don't know if those statistics are correct. I know that there are a lot that assert that the department has not been as effective since the administration change in getting determinations and decisions made for students. To talk about this, the department has stated that they are continuing the review. There have been, I believe, the last count I saw was some 73,000 decisions made, with certainly a number of others yet to be made. So I don't quite think that limited number is accurate. What I can tell you is that, again, the courts and these various decisions play into which buckets or which cohorts of individuals are eligible and which may not be eligible. And the department is utilizing all of the tools at their disposal to make the decisions and make the determinations. They thought that they were going to withhold some of those based on their delays and changes in regulation, but now the courts have seen fit to say that they need to move forward with some of those. So while the numbers may be, again, kind of fuzzy, the reality is that I think the courts have shown, and the department has shown by its recent decisions based on the court, that they are going to move forward with making determinations as best they can, providing the relief for students that truly deserve it, and putting these regulatory issues behind them with the new regulations that they hope to propose in final form before the end of the year, and that will become effective July 1 of 2020.
Well, maybe we will have a little bit of clarity to that mud pie that you were talking about earlier.
We hope to, and we also, in conversations that we've had with Department of Ed officials, I think that the interim guidance that will be out this month, when I say this month, by the time this comes out on November 1st or thereabouts, sometime in the month of November, we believe the department will be providing transitional guidance information to all of the concerned and affected parties.
Excellent. Gainful employment, there's stuff going on with that as well, isn't there?
There is. Similar to the borrower defense to repayment and final rules that we had hoped would be published in final form by November 1st, the court cases with BDR, borrower defense to repayment, indicated that the department would not meet their effective November 1st deadline for either borrower defense or gainful employment. That means that regulations that have been in effect and literally gone through two iterations, both under the Obama administration, 2009 and 2012-14, are in place and will remain so, while new regulatory proposals that would eliminate the loss of eligibility under certain criteria will be potentially repealed. But again, those regulations now wouldn't go into effect until July 1 of 2020. There is some belief that under statutory authority and regulatory capability, that the Secretary of Education might provide an opportunity for early implementation of some of the changes under the gainful employment rule. But again, we have to be patient and wait and see what the department publishes in their final reg, likely before the end of the year, whether or not as a clear caveat in that regulation, they provide the entities, meaning in this instance the schools, the opportunity for early implementation and what timeline that might make as opposed to July 1 of 2020.
I'm absolutely sighing with all the things that are going on and the craziness. I read it and I don't understand all of it. Thank heavens we've got folks like you up there who certainly can understand it. What about credit hour? I mean, credit hour is a huge one, having to do with how college courses are assessed. Are they valid courses? Then you bring in the competency-based education. What's going on with credit hours, and what can we expect to see over the next year or so?
Another good question. And the interesting thing is, while we originally thought that would align with a potential July 1, 2020 effective date, it looks like now all of these things will align with a July 1st, 2020 effective date. But speaking directly to definition of a credit hour, this has been one that, candidly, a lot of the traditional higher education community have been waiting in line and waiting for their turn with the department to focus on issues related to changes, again, made by the Obama administration on how to calculate the number of hours of outside preparatory time and other facets of what go into the determination of a credit hour, and therefore the amount of aid delivered based on the number of credit hours. This plays particularly into the importance of online education, the upcoming negotiated rulemaking, and as you noted, January, February, and March of the coming year, 2019, will be involved in negotiated rulemaking, a process where the department selects individuals from all of the higher education and interested communities to come and discuss the regulations and proposed changes to the regulations. Those will take place in January, February, and March. We'll cover all online education, the definition of a credit hour, direct assessment, competency-based learning, and how all of those are delivered and how federal financial aid might be utilized in the delivery of all of those different modalities. And that process will conclude with another development of regulations that are proposed. probably in the midsummer. And like now, the hope that they would be published in final form with whatever comes out by November 1st of 2019, making them effective July 1, 2020. So we might see a lot of regulatory alignment and changes all on July 1 of 2020.
Just in time for the next presidential election.
Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. And what are the chances? No, that's a crystal ball question. What are the chances of the next president setting everything aside?
Well, again, if past is prologue, each of the prior administrations have come in. And when I say each of the prior administrations, this goes back many, many different presidencies. You can track this back far beyond current day, and also the pending implications of any reauthorization that I'm sure we'll talk about here in a few minutes, the reauthorization of the underlying statute. But it is the capability of each administration to come in and place their stamp or their review on the regulatory process. And we certainly have seen, especially in the absence of actual legislation in a timely fashion, the regulatory process basically usurp a lot of the statutory authority that normally comes from Congress's 5 to 6 year renewal of the underlying law as part of what then turns into their ability to push political agendas through regulation in lieu of statutory guidance from both houses of Congress.
And when you talk about this statutory guidance from both houses of Congress, you're talking about the higher education reauthorization, are you not?
That is correct. Under the law, the 1965 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act is supposed to be reauthorized, a process to bring it up to current day every 5 to 6 years. Unfortunately, Congress is running on about a 10-year window. The last two reauthorizations took place in 1998 and 2008. We obviously will not see, as I said earlier, a reauthorization completed this year before the midterm elections and before the end of the 115th Congress. So we're now looking at the prospect of reauthorization and the next opportunity for Congress to make changes to the law in 2019 or 2020.
Well, there was hope that we would have some sort of bipartisan agreement coming out of Congress this year with respect to the Higher Education Act, but that didn't happen. With the midterms coming up, what's your crystal ball say? What's going to be the impact for higher ed?
If I knew the answer to that, I also probably would have been that gentleman down in South Carolina that won the $1 billion. I wish I had that kind of insight. Nobody really knows at this point, Drum. What I can tell you is that CSPEN, as well as everybody in D.C., are actively watching all of the polls, and all of the discussions and deliberations are going on about the different eventualities based on a House conversion from Democrat to Republican, from Republican to Democrat, or a Senate conversion from Republican to Democrat, both or neither. So nobody really knows, but we're all certainly watching it. I can tell you that C-SPEN is looking at the impacts that all of those probabilities or variables would have on the committee structures, and looking yet again at all of the various principles and bills that the Democrats and Republicans have put forward, because in a year when you were anticipating reauthorization to be done, there is a myriad of legislation that is put forward. Democrats and Republicans alike have seen fit to provide all of those proposals. They didn't complete the process, but we have that insight to draw upon as we prepare to look for reauthorization in the 116th Congress, like I said, probably sometime in 2019, 2020. And back to your early question, that means that once again, you can see that the regulatory process is basically what guides policy in that intervening period while the legislative process tries to catch up.
Well, we certainly hope it does, and we can expect some sort of bipartisanship out of Washington. As the saying goes, I'm not going to hold my breath.
No, nor should you, but we'll continue to be very busy, and there will continue, rest assured, to be things for you to talk about on these wonderful podcasts, and for us to try and share through C-SPEN in a timely and accurate fashion.
Absolutely. So what are the things are you guys focused on in the near term?
Well, why don't I kind of take the lead on that, since we're not talking about a specific policy on here. Right now, we're really working on setting up our next calendar year, doing some, forethought and some planning. Every week, we do what we call Tom Bombs, which are the newsletters that you get in your email drum that you've actually had you reach out to us. We send those out to about 6,500 people across the United States. We do webinars on a regular basis. Tom will be starting to do some 3-minute, I don't remember what you're calling those, kind of a 3-minute video that'll wrap up on the Hill a couple times a month. That will also be on our website. Of course, in January, we've got the new Congress and everything that they're going to be doing and how we're going to reanalyze what we do around that. In February, we have our first Hill Day on February 11th to the 13th in D.C. And then, of course, our annual conference, which is August 21st in Chicago. Kind of what our year is looking like so far.
The Hill Day, I got your advertisement on that. That is intriguing. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you would.
Well, really what the schools have been asking for is to be able to get in front of some of the policymakers on the Hill that Tom is referring to when he sends out all the emails, and being able to share their stories and their student success. Before they do that, they'll have the opportunity to come in, and we'll be updating them with some different information that I'll let Tom elaborate on.
To that point, one of the things that we're focused on, as I said, is just sharing information with them with the new Congress. And as I alluded to, what we're already tracking is, what are the principles of the Democratic side of the House and what are the Republican? And I don't mean side of the House, meaning House or Senate chambers, but your policies were driven by the Republican proposals, your policies driven by the Democratic proposals. And candidly, sharing with all of those that are interested and inclined the desire to be able to talk to both sides with equal degree of support. And what I mean by that is picking apart their proposals and showing that there are a number of Democratic as well as Republican proposals that we would like to see strongly considered as they're working to develop the new legislation. We have sometimes been pigeonholed, Drum, and you know this from a lot of the discussions and, again, some of your other podcasts with other groups. We sometimes get pigeonholed as to only being somebody or an entity or a community willing to talk to one side of the aisle. That couldn't be further from the truth. We might have more receptivity from one side of the aisle than the other, but our goal and our objective has been and always will be to continue to share information that enables our institutions and our community to go to both sides of the House and Senate, meaning and both sides of the two-party system, and share all of the good and the value of what our community does in the hopes that as they continue to modify the legislation and look at the policy changes as well through compliance and the regulation, that we get a fair and equitable shake in that process, and that our institutions, our students, and the programs that provide them with access to the workforce are all geared towards ways in which we are an equal and viable part of the community.
Couldn't be said any better, Tom. Thank you. Hey, a quick question on the negotiated rulemaking. There's a call out for people to participate in that. What are the kind of things that they're looking for? Because I'm wondering if some of the folks who might be listening to the podcast might be a good party to participate in this.
The deadline is November 15th, and it gives me and affords me the opportunity. The next round of negotiated rulemaking actually has one major subject topic and 3 subtopics. The major topic is accreditation and innovation. So as you can imagine, a lot of the discussion will focus around the role of accreditation and also the oversight of accreditation by the Department of Education and Congress. Innovation speaks to, once again, as I alluded to earlier, those discussions around are things like the definition of a credit hour and the inability to provide federal student financial aid based on direct assessment or competency-based or even boot camp type programs, limiting the ability for all types of institutions, not any one subset, for all types of institutions to provide more direct education and, quite honestly, more expedient education, thereby potentially reducing the overall loan indebtedness of students. All of that plays into it. So there is a subcommittee that is on, quote unquote, distance education, online learning. Then there are 2 other subcommittees, one focused on faith-based education. There were recent decisions in the courts yet again, all the way up to the Supreme Court, that have implications for faith-based institutions and delivery of financial aid. And then there is also the Teach Grants, which are programs, as the name would imply, that focus primarily and almost exclusively on support for educational programs for teachers and the like, and those grant programs and how they are all shaped and what the loan forgiveness and other type of criterion are for that. So therein lies basically the communities and the major subject areas. To your question of who can be involved, the department makes very clear in the announcement that they put forward, and I'll share that URL with you. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I'll share it with you, Drum, and you can share it with those that are interested in finding out more. But the easiest place to find it is literally just go to the Department of Education's website, www.ed.gov, type in 2018-19 negotiated rulemaking, and it'll take you to the landing page where all of this information can be found and more. But they break down the actual participants into a group of 13 or 14 individuals that sit around the table, and it is a diverse group representing all forms of institutions of higher education, normally one seat for each of the major types and classes of institutions. You have a space for states attorneys general and other state-related individuals, as you would expect, and as we all would want. There are at least one, if not more, seats for students and student groups. There are seats for student advocacy groups, financial aid individuals. With accreditation being such a major portion of this one, there might be more than the obligatory 1 to 2 seats for accreditors. So obviously the numbers and the makeup and the complexity of the team and the committee changes depending on the subject matter, but you're roughly talking about 14 individuals times 2, because you have a lead and an alternate for each of the full committee and the 3 subcommittees. So lots of opportunity for those that are interested and inclined and have a vested interest in these issues to consider putting their nominees forward. I can say in concluding that CSPEN is in the process right now of working through our communities, and note the word there, S, communities, that's plural from all those different venues. That's one of the reasons that, once again, the uniqueness of having third-party servicers that have helped develop CSPEN as well as the institutions themselves gives us a broad array of gray matter and subject specialists and knowledgeable individuals from which to draw upon to potentially have as nominees. And we will be submitting those by the November 15th deadline.
That's great. Thanks for that overview of the process and what's going to happen and the kinds of folks who will be needed. We're getting close to the end of our time. I was wondering, any last words of wisdom for us?
I don't know if it's last words of wisdom, but if anyone wants to find out more about us, our website is centralstate.edu.com.
Great.
You can go there, and that's where we'll be posting all the updates. And if you would like to receive our newsletter, any information, sign up right there and get it.
Yeah, I would highly encourage listeners to sign up for the newsletter. It's filled with great information right off the steps of the Capitol Hill and the ED department. It's one of those that I suggest you don't miss.
And the other concluding remark that I would make is stay on podcasts like yours, Drum, and whatever resources you find most comfortable, meaning you, the public, find most comfortable to utilize, continue to stay informed. Things do move very quickly these days. Sometimes they move quickly and then stall, as is the case with the anticipated release of the final rules that are now not going to be effective when we thought they would. But continuing to stay informed means you continue to stay in compliance and you continue to be able to service your community and bring those students forward with quality education, leading to their opportunities in the workforce. And that's what I've been committed to for these 29 years. I've seen the best that we have to offer and want to make sure that everybody is aware of the best that we are and have always been.
Well, great. Jeri, Tom, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting and hopefully helpful for our listeners, and would love to have you back on the show again in the future.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. And as some of these things become more clear, Drum, let's talk about what we can finally say definitively is about to what right now we can only speculate about.
Absolutely. Would love to be able to do that. Thanks, folks. Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guests, Jeri Prochaska and Tom Netting. Thanks to both of you. A very informative session. Our next guest is Dr. Dewey Clark, president of North Carolina Wesleyan, who will talk with us about the perspectives of sitting in the top seat, the importance of bringing business skills to higher ed, and how to grow enrollment in Christian colleges and other institutions of higher education. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires 3 things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those three things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.